This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason. In this episode 870 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. I know every fantasy football podcast is going to break down free agency, and some of you might be tired of all the takes at this point. And I can't lie to you. I don't know if my stances on what happened during free agency, I don't know if those stances are going to be unique. I don't know if any perspective is going to be different than what you've already heard. What I can tell you is that I always do my best to be rational with my thoughts. And I have plenty of math to back up my feelings on these moves. But yeah, this episode is a pretty generic episode. It's one where I'll be looking at some of the bigger moves that went down in free agency. And I'll be talking about how those moves impact things in fantasy football. And because there were so many things that happened, I won't be able to get to everything. But I chose some of the bigger storylines that may be tougher for gamers to figure out right now. Before getting into things though, don't forget to check out Underdog Fantasy. It's the best and easiest place to play fantasy sports. You can draft a fantasy football team in minutes, and with their best ball format, there's no waivers, trades, or lineup setting. There's no league management after your draft. You can sit back and relax. Drafts are happening right now over there. I know that because I'm participating. And you can use the information that I share on here or in my prospect guide to help you draft. If you're new to Underdog, make sure you use promo code LATEROUND when you sign up. When you do that, you'll get a deposit match up to $100. That's promo code LATEROUND. Head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog Fantasy app to sign up. I think the single biggest move of free agency, at least in terms of how things will impact fantasy football, is with Kirk Cousins going to Atlanta. Over the last 2 years under Arthur Smith, the Falcons ranked 31st and 29th in pass rate. They had 415 and 530 pass attempts over those 2 seasons. Now we're getting a new coaching staff in Atlanta, which includes Sean McVay coaching tree hire Zach Robinson as offensive coordinator. Robinson had worked as the quarterback's coach and passing game coordinator in LA over the last 2 seasons, and he was on the staff since 2019. Chances are the Falcons are going to want to sling it, at least far more than what they did under Artie Smith. Cousins is also coming from Minnesota, where he played under Kevin O'Connell over the last 2 seasons. And Minnesota was 3rd in the NFL both seasons in pass rate. Right before he got the head coaching gig for the Vikings, Kevin O'Connell, as most of you guys know, he was the offensive coordinator for the Rams. That was in 2020 and 2021, under Sean McVay. A pass-heavier offense with Cousins is going to have a massive effect on the weapons in Atlanta. Kyle Pitts should become a more reliable piece. Drake London, who scored really well in my year 2 model last year, and he's someone I've touted a lot over the last year, he now looks like a potential wide receiver 1 in fantasy. And then there's Bijan Robinson. Robinson had what many thought was a disappointing season given the cost to acquire him last year. But his target share, his receiving work, was excellent. Among rookie running backs since 2011, Robinson's per-game target share trailed only Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, and Alvin Kamara. Now, I know a lot of people are saying that you should buy into the Falcons' offense right now. And even though that's going to drive up their ADPs, I still think it's valid. Unless you just started listening to me, you know that I'm a fan of a lot of the pieces there. And now you've got the right kind of coordinator and the right kind of quarterback to score fantasy points. My early projections think that London and Bijan Robinson specifically could be studs this year. London a lower-end wide receiver 1, and Robinson the RB2 in 2024. And I think if anyone can get close to Christian McCaffrey this year, it might be Bijan Robinson, if things break his way. And Breece Hall gets a nod there too. But this is a giant W for fantasy managers who invested in these guys last season. Assuming that Kirk Cousins can come back and be his healthy self. This result could have been much, much worse. The only other big quarterback move was probably what we saw in Pittsburgh. But then the Steelers also moved on from Deontay Johnson, and it's a nice transition from talking about Arthur Smith's old team to his new one, because he's now the offensive coordinator for Pittsburgh. So let's briefly touch on the Steelers. In my eyes, the quarterback position was upgraded when Russell Wilson signed in Pittsburgh. And now Justin Fields is backing him up. Kenny Pickett is gone. I don't think we've ever seen a bigger quarterback room overhaul in league history. The bottom line with the Pittsburgh offense, though, is that the aforementioned Arthur Smith is running that offense. Smith is known for his run-heavy mentality, which I actually think is fine enough for a Pittsburgh team that constantly tries to be competitive. Like, it's not the way that I would team build, but if you're going to have question marks at quarterback, you might as well find a coordinator that you can feel confident in with his run game. And Smith can at least provide that, even if it's an inefficient way to run an offense in 2024. Smith ranked 29th and 31st over his last 2 seasons in pass rate as the head coach in Atlanta. But they were 2 seasons with some really bad quarterback play. During his first year in Atlanta, the Falcons were 8th in pass rate. They actually had an above-average dropbacks over expected rate. And that was with Matt Ryan under center. As offensive coordinator in Tennessee, which was Smith's previous stop before Atlanta, the Titans were 30th and 29th in pass rate. That was with Ryan Tannehill. Smith was a big help to Tannehill's resurgence in the NFL. And I think that's what we're really hoping for with the Steelers offense in 2024. We're hoping that Russell Wilson can revitalize his career similar to how Ryan Tannehill did in that 2-year window. And it's not unlike what we had in Tennessee. You've got a veteran quarterback whose previous team gave up on him. You have run game pieces and running backs in place. And you've got your hypothetical alpha wide receiver. Smith had A.J. Brown in 2019 and 2020. Those were Brown's first 2 years in the league. Now he'll have George Pickens, who is not A.J. Brown. He's not that kind of talent. And I say Pickens only because the Steelers traded away Deontay Johnson. I'm assuming that they're going to do more at the position. But it's not like they need to go crazy in an Arthur Smith offense. Historically, top receivers in this offense have been fine on the target share front. A.J. Brown saw a 20% target share per game rate as a rookie in 2019. His rate as a second-year player was 26%. In Atlanta, Drake London has seen target shares of 29% and 23%. But the obvious problem is that players like Brown and London needed those shares in order to be fantasy relevant because the passing volume just wasn't there. And that's probably the biggest problem and fear with George Pickens. London and Brown are better wide receivers than Pickens is. Pickens had a pretty underrated 2023 where his yards per route run sat at 2.11, but that's a huge improvement over 2022. And London himself has been at 2.07 and 1.86 over his first 2 years in the league. That's in yards per route run. And A.J. Brown was just on another level too. So I don't think that George Pickens is necessarily as good as Drake London and A.J. Brown. Since 2019, when Smith became offensive coordinator for Tennessee and then went to coach Atlanta, the highest raw target total a wide receiver has seen in an Arthur Smith offense is just 117. That would have ranked 23rd in football last year. And that includes offensive talent like A.J. Brown and Drake London. That's the fear with George Pickens, that this offense is super, super run heavy and even a high target share won't really help him out. With that being said, I actually think there's a chance that Pickens is still a decent get in fantasy this year. He's got a reasonable wide receiver 32 price tag on Underdog right now. And I'd be surprised at this point if he makes it into the 4th round of your managed league drafts this summer. My early projections have him a handful of wide receiver spots higher than that. You might be able to play into the market's beliefs a bit here because there's this run-heavy offense that's going to doom George Pickens, right? The market just generally knows that this is an Arthur Smith offense. I think that's going to hurt him a ton. Yes, don't get me wrong. I just went through numbers to show you that Arthur Smith likes to run the football. But number one, that seems priced in right now. Number two, part of that price assumes that there's no step forward with Russell Wilson, or that Wilson won't work that much in this offense, which I think is premature. And then number three, Pickens is coming off a really underrated 2023 season, where I think there's at least room for growth as a player. What if George Pickens is just better than what the market thinks? I wouldn't be buying him much higher than where he's at. And this is more of a redraft take, more of an underdog take rather than dynasty. But it's not totally awful for him given Deontay Johnson is now out of town. We saw an absurd number of running back moves during this free agency period, and the most meaningful one was probably Saquon Barkley going to Philadelphia. I said this on Late Round Perspectives last week, but how you feel about Saquon Barkley in Philly could depend on your own perspective. I think it's an upgrade from the Giants, But I do think that we continuously overvalue the situation in Philadelphia when it comes to running backs. Jalen Hurts has now been starter in Philly for 3 years. In those 3 seasons, Eagles running backs have ranked 17th, 16th, and 25th in PPR points scored. This isn't automatically an amazing situation because we know there's a mobile quarterback. And that mobile quarterback takes plays away from everyone in the offense, both between the 20s and at the goal line. Now, the positive side to this is that they haven't had a running back like Saquon Barkley. And I would imagine that not only do they lean on their backs more as a result, or Saquon Barkley more as a result, but Saquon's going to see a larger chunk of the team's running back points. I also don't think that we can assume they're going to tush push the way they've been tush pushing with Jason Kelce out of the picture now. We can't just ignore that. And that could help Saquon out at the goal line. So at the moment, I'm about at market with Saquon. My projections have him as a low-end RB1, and he'll be drafted in best ball a little bit above that, more in the RB7, RB8 range. But I don't have a crazy issue with that. I'd have a bigger issue if people were taking him over someone like Kyren Williams, who just has a better volume profile. Now, I don't know if I'm going to have a ton of Barkley this year, and you should understand that Philadelphia is not this ideal situation, this ideal destination. It's not a bad one, but it's not a great one, like some people would believe. But if you want to invest in Barkley, that's not one that I'm going to argue with. There's enough single game upside there to understand the appeal. Where I think I may end up differing versus the market this year is with Josh Jacobs. He's now a Green Bay Packer, and with the Packers releasing Aaron Jones, Jacobs is their bell cow right now. He's their RB1. I have a few questions about this, though. The first is, how good is Josh Jacobs at this point? Last season, Jacobs' rushing yards over expected per rush was minus 0.4. Zamir White in the same offense was at plus 0.3. It's not totally apples to apples, but it's interesting nonetheless. White had a better success rate and EPA per carry too. That's according to Next Gen Stats. My number 2 question is, are we going to see a split backfield? Matt LaFleur has traditionally split his backfields up. And we can sit here and we can say that it was for the greater good. It was a good football move. But was it? Has it really been objectively smart? LaFleur was with the Rams as an offensive coordinator in 2017, and they fed Todd Gurley that year. So that's at least one good sign. The problem is, coaches saw what happened with Gurley. And I think as humans, that brings a lot of caution. Because look at what LaFleur did when he went to Tennessee as offensive coordinator there in 2018. The backfield was Derrick Henry and Dion Lewis. DeMarco Murray wasn't around Henry anymore. Henry ended up seeing just 58% of the team's running back rushes per game. He carried the ball just 215 times all season to Dion Lewis's 155 attempts. In Green Bay, we've seen split backfields. Since 2019, which is when LaFleur got to Green Bay, the median top running back rush share by a Packers back was 59.6%. When you do that exercise for every NFL team, that's a bottom 7 number. I think it's rational to look at this current backfield with Jacobs and A.J. Dillon, who re-signed there, and give Jacobs a good backfield share. But I do think it's a little different than a player in a different spot. And then the last thing that I question is the receiving upside. Jacobs is definitely a capable receiver, but it hasn't always been there for him. He's hit a double-digit percentage target share in each of his last 3, but he maxed out last year at a 13.3% target share. That's not a bad number, but it's not necessarily what we see from elite backs. And then what worries me a little bit isn't if Jacobs is going to be the top receiving back in this offense. He's a better receiver than A.J. Dillon. What worries me is that the Packers have a lot of alternatives in that offense at pass catcher. You have Jaden Reed, Christian Watson, Dontavian Wicks, Romeo Doubs, 2 capable pass-catching tight ends. There's only a 100% target share to divvy up. There could be somewhat of a cap ceiling there for Josh Jacobs. Now, I don't think he's in like this bad spot. The Packers' offense is likely to be pretty good this year, and he will see volume. My fear is that he's going to get steamed up, that people are going to want to draft him in like the late first round in managed redraft leagues. That he's a locked-in top 10 back. I don't think that's really the case. But I do want to wait until I get more clarity on his ADP before I definitively say that I'm in or out. For now, just know that there are some question marks. With Josh Jacobs out of Vegas, Zamir White is now currently the RB1 for the Raiders. And that could be big, because as the team's top running back down the stretch last year, he was solid. During the team's final 4 weeks last season, White averaged a 9.4% target share per game rate. His running back rush share per game rate was 87%. And he scored between 13 and 17.5 PPR points in every contest. Heath Cummings and I talked about White for a bit on last week's Perspectives episode, and we had the same general thoughts. There's a very real chance that the market makes some assumptions about the Raiders' backfield as we enter the draft, that the Raiders will get a running back in that draft. And while that's definitely possible, we have to remember that this running back class isn't very strong. It's not that special. It's very possible that the running back they'd hypothetically draft, that running back isn't any better than Zamir White, whether as a prospect or right now. And there's a chance they just go for depth rather than take a running back with high draft capital. And then on Monday, the Raiders decided to sign Alexander Mattison too. To me, that says that they're fine with White as their RB1, and then Mattison as the RB2. Maybe some see it as legit competition, maybe others see it as nothing, and that they still might go to the draft to get a running back. To me, it says that this could just be their backfield in 2024, that they're okay with Zamir White being their RB1. I think that's a real possibility, and we should buy into that to some degree. Now, Zamir White didn't have a good year 2 model score. The year 2 model helps predict how well a player is going to perform in year 2 and year 3 of his NFL career by looking at rookie season inputs as well as a player's prospect score. White's wasn't great because he wasn't a can't miss prospect and he didn't do anything as a rookie. Now, with that being said, from a redraft standpoint, the year 2 model doesn't have that much predictiveness for third year running backs when you factor in ADP. This is something I talked about last week. If you look at middle round running backs since 2011 who are in their third year in the NFL, there's no correlation between those running backs exceeding ADP expectation and year 2 score. That's because if a player's a third year guy and he's being drafted as a middle round pick, chances are he hasn't truly broken out yet. And if a player had a high year 2 score and he still hasn't truly broken out, or he's a middle round pick in year 3, there's probably a problem. There's probably something going on there. A perfect example of this is with Clyde Edwards-Helaire. As a prospect, even though he did have some warts, he wasn't a horrific prospect, especially with draft capital. And then after year 1, he had some production, so his year 2 score wasn't awful. But then in year 2, he didn't do that much. So then in year 3, his ADP was in the middle rounds. It wasn't very strong. What does that tell you? It tells you that there might be problems with Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Or else why wouldn't he be an early round pick? So from a redraft perspective, I think buying into Zamir White right now makes a ton of sense. Because I'm not that fearful of the competition they might bring in, whether it's a rookie running back or if it is Alexander Mattison. Neither of those scenarios scare me a lot, because I don't think there's a high chance that they use an early round pick on a running back. Now, from a dynasty perspective, you can hold off if you want, but there's a chance that people are concerned there too. And I'm always for playing against the market. As of right now, I'm more on the buy side with Zamir White than the sell side. I've been wrong about Derrick Henry more than I've been right through the years. He's broken math, he's broken logic, and he's truly a one-of-one type of player in this era of NFL. There's nothing wrong with admitting that. He's now in Baltimore, and the fit is absolutely perfect in my opinion. He's never going to be a high-volume receiver, and the Ravens have ranked 29th, 26th, 31st, 30th, and 20th in running back target share since Lamar Jackson became starter. That's fine. A healthy Derrick Henry can produce in this offense. Last year under new offensive coordinator Todd Monken, Ravens backs only trailed the Dolphins, 49ers, and Lions in fantasy points scored. That was with just 2 receiving touchdowns. It's no guarantee that they'll be that good this year, but it's not hard to see this is a top half destination for a guy like Derrick Henry. The concern is whether or not Henry still has it. We've seen some of his numbers drop in recent years, and he's now 30 years old. This is his 9th NFL season. Since 2011, when looking at the top 3 rounds of redraft leagues, and this is my fantasy league ADP, We've seen 9 running back seasons where the back was drafted in that range in the first 3 rounds while in his 9th year in the league or later. The list includes guys like LaShawn McCoy, Adrian Peterson, Marshawn Lynch, Frank Gore, Steven Jackson, and there is 1 season of Darren Sproles. When those players have had ADPs in the top 3 rounds, literally none of them have outperformed ADP expectation. Now let me explain ADP expectation really quick. Every player is expected to score some number of fantasy points per game at whatever ADP they have. Like a 32nd overall running back would be expected to score 13 PPR points per game based on history. When you compare that versus how the player actually performed, you can see who under and overperformed versus expectation. And every single one of these early round old running backs have underperformed expectation. That's a huge red flag for Derrick Henry. I think that's enough reason to not be overweight on him this year. But I'm still going to have a little bit of exposure because the fit is there, the situation is there, and Derrick Henry has beaten the odds before. Now, speaking of Derrick Henry, his old team is the Tennessee Titans, and they did a couple of things that messed with the fantasy football world too. That was adding both Tony Pollard and Calvin Ridley. The Calvin Ridley signing, it was pretty surprising, but they definitely needed help at wide receiver. It doesn't look like Treylon Burks is it. So having someone opposite of DeAndre Hopkins and allowing the team to move their wide receivers all over the field, having that versatility, it makes sense from a real football standpoint. We won't talk contract details, I just mean from a real football fit perspective. The issue is that the Tennessee Titans offense is currently being led by a huge question mark in Will Levis. Levis ranked dead last in 2023 in completion percentage over expected according to Next Gen Stats. He was 24th out of 35 qualified quarterbacks in EPA per dropback. If you look at how rookie quarterbacks have performed historically and try to project forward, you'd likely place Will Levis in a probable bust bucket as opposed to a probable hit one, right? Will Levis is more likely to bust than hit at this point. But if you want the positives, he can at least get it down the field. And the Titans should be more pass heavy with a coaching staff that's skewed that way more in 2023. I'm probably not going to have a lot of D-Hop or Calvin Ridley, but I understand this move from a real football perspective. The Tony Pollard signing was really interesting to me because I think most of us assumed that the Titans would get some other running back to compete with Tyjae Spears. But I envisioned more of a bruiser. And Pollard showed us last year he's probably not that. Here's where I'm at with the Pollard-Spears split. This is now an ambiguous backfield where we're probably going to see RB3 type costs for both of these guys. People will run away from those backfields. People hate ambiguous backfields because from a projection standpoint, they don't look great. But as we know, we should run toward them because players can emerge from ambiguous backfields and they emerge all the time. And right now, I would bet more on Spears than Pollard. Not because I think Spears is going to be this bell cow in the NFL. That's something that I've consistently talked about since he was coming out last year. But I do think that he showed out in a big way in year 1 as a receiver. And historically, second-year running backs have been better ceiling bets than sixth-year running backs have. So in my opinion, I think you can still take some shots at that backfield. I don't think it's necessarily an amazing situation, but don't let a split backfield push you away because in the end, split backfields see lower costs in the fantasy football market. Their ADPs fall, and that can create bigger values. Now, another split backfield to talk about today is the one in Cincinnati. Joe Mixon's out, Zach Moss is in. I sent a late round newsletter blast out last week, which you can subscribe for free. Just go to lateround.com. But I sent this email blast out about Chase Brown, where I asked if Chase Brown is this year's Rachaad White. He's a second-year player and a pretty up-in-the-air backfield. It seems like a reasonable comparison, or a reasonable thing to dig into. Well, Brown's score in the year 2 model is below 70. Players below that mark rarely work out in year 2 and year 3, and pretty much beyond. But we're talking only 3 of them since 2011, giving us an RB1 points per game season, with those being CJ Anderson, Myles Gaskin, and then last year, Kyren Williams. If you want to talk about RB2 seasons, you can add Chris Carson and Damian Harris to that list. It's really hard to overcome that low of a score. On top of that, I looked at second-year middle-round running backs since 2011 by redraft ADP, and I looked at backs who had year 2 scores above 70, and then the backs who had scores below 70. And the second-year middle-round running backs who had year 2 scores below 70 really struggled. Their median difference between expected points per game by ADP and actual points per game was minus 1.8. The other group was plus 2.4. And that's the group that had Rachaad White in it last year. Now, similar to the Tennessee situation, go ahead and throw some darts at this ambiguous backfield. I think because of the year 2 model stuff, I'll probably have more Zach Moss than Chase Brown in redraft. And I'd be willing to see if I could flip Brown right now for a second rounder in rookie drafts. Because while he does have enough of a weekly ceiling due to his big playability, there's so much working against him. The odds that he becomes someone that you're really mad at yourself for trading away, those odds are clearly small. I think best ball is a separate beast, but I'm probably still going to have more Zach Moss than Chase Brown on Underdog this year too. Keep all of that in mind with this backfield. The last item I want to get to today is with Marquise Brown. Him going to Kansas City, it's a perfect fit. A problem with Brown is that he's quite literally seen worse efficiency marks every single year of his career. His yards per route run started at an impressive 1.81 during his rookie season, Lamar Jackson's first MVP season. It's gotten worse every single year since then. It was just 1.25 last year. But he still commanded high target shares in his offenses. Brown had a 22.7% target share per game rate last year. It was almost 24% the year before that. He's hit a 22% per game target share in each of his last 4 seasons. That's at least a signal for talent. And now he's in a much more advantageous situation with Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. Kansas City, despite winning the Super Bowl, they still had a glaring hole at wide receiver. They needed someone who could really stretch the field, and Brown can do that. Despite a down year, he was second on Arizona last season in average depth of target, and we've seen him make huge plays throughout his career. That pairs so unbelievably well with Rashee Rice. The big question mark with Rice, for me at least, is how he can grow as a wideout. Grow from being more of that lower A-dot yards after the catch wide receiver. Because in 2023, he ranked second among 50-plus target receivers in percentage of targets that came from screens. And among 50-plus target rookie wideouts since 2011, only Rondale Moore and Jarvis Landry had a lower average depth of target than Rashee Rice. I think it's fine to say that Rice got by a little bit this past season by lack of competition. He's extremely good with the ball in his hands. And this is the offense to be in to help him generate a ton of yards after the catch. Don't take this the wrong way. Rashee Rice is good, and he's in the perfect spot for Rashee Rice. I'm just saying that with Hollywood Brown there, it's a good fit for Rice to maintain that role to a high level. To still see a high target share. He can still maintain that awesome target share that made him so fantasy relevant. And now the Chiefs probably feel less pressure to take a wide receiver super high in the draft. Although that's definitely still in play. But it's a good fit overall. It's a great fit. I think Brown can be a solid wide receiver 3 in fantasy this year. And Rice, to me, is fair in the late second round of best ball drafts right now. Now, there were other free agency storylines that I didn't get to today. For sure. 2 backfield situations I specifically didn't get to are with Aaron Jones in Minnesota and Joe Mixon in Houston. I'll gladly talk more about those players on mailbag episodes. But I think we generally know what's going on there. Jones is probably going to see a similar backfield share as what he saw in Green Bay, and Mixon will likely be the bell cow for Houston at this point. And there's also Austin Eckler in Washington and DeAndre Swift in Chicago too. I wanted to instead focus on some of the situations where people just have more questions. The more interesting situations in my mind. And hopefully I was able to answer those questions for you. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll have a mailbag episode for you later in the week. I'll talk to you then.